Welcome to VSOW. Today, we're doing a deep and I think really necessary examination of a term you hear a lot these days. It's everywhere, online, financial circles, but even just broader culture. Fuck you, money. F you, money. Now, the term itself, it's obviously provocative, right? Suggests maybe aggression or just telling someone off. But the sources we've looked at, they suggest the real idea behind it is much deeper. It's not just about having a huge bank balance. It's more like a philosophy, really, centered on achieving total personal autonomy. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And that's why this deep dive feels so crucial. Often the conversation around financial independence or FI, it gets a bit stuck on just the numbers, setting targets. And that risks ignoring these really profound psychological shifts, the ethical questions, and even the sort of structural issues that come with chasing or having that kind of wealth. So our mission today is to synthesize a pretty challenging, diverse set of sources. We're looking at, well, everything from personal stories on blogs and forums, financial ones mostly,
Right.
all the way to quite rigorous academic papers in sociology, especially some interesting work from the London School of Economics, and also some cutting-edge psychological research.
And we're trying to structure this analysis around three core themes, really, to get at what true financial liberation means. What are those main areas? Okay, so first, we absolutely have to dissect the definition itself, the actual number, the quantifiable target for wealth. Second, we'll explore that crucial mindset shift. What happens psychologically when someone actually achieves this kind of independence? And then third, maybe the weightiest part is examining the societal context. How does this intersect with class? What are the ethical consequences of having wealth? And this vital but tricky idea of contentment. We're really aiming to pull out the core insights from all this material, trying to keep a professional and structured approach to the analysis throughout our discussion. #tag defining financial liberation from cash to consequence.
Okay, let's start where the idea kind of began, right? The traditional, almost mythical definition of FU money. Williamson's work actually calls it a meme, but it's clearly rooted in a long-standing desire.
Indeed. The classic understanding, as it's laid out in the source material, it describes an amount of wealth that's so significant that, quote, typical restrictions and conventions no longer apply to you. This isn't just about financial security paying the bills. This wealth acts like an absolute shield against, well, external pressure or coercion.
The power it gives is immediate, very personal, and deeply relational. It means someone can just bypass gatekeepers, right? They don't have to compromise their values or do jobs they hate. The source even suggests, quite starkly, that in extreme situations, this level of wealth implies you, quote, don't even need to follow the law. That really speaks to the sheer, almost frightening power implied here.
Yeah, it's a strong claim. But what's fascinating, right away, is the contrast drawn in the same material between this pure wealth accumulation and something the author calls fuck you freedom. Now this is different. It achieves liberation through another route by actively cultivating a profound lack of reliance on established systems or groups rather than just having, billions in the bank.
That is a really critical distinction. The focus shifts, doesn't it, from just piling up money to strategically insulating yourself.
Exactly. Fuck you freedom is defined by things like mobility, low dependency. So practically, that means maybe no physical ties holding you back, no rigid schedules you have to follow, and a deeper kind of insulation from, say, economic shocks. If someone structures their life this way, the sources suggest they can achieve such a radical self-reliance that they almost don't need to care about the wider economy, or even if the power grid goes down.
And we have that great historical anecdote that really captures this older idea of autonomy perfectly. The deep dish source mentions Humphrey Bogart back in the 1920s.
Bogart's method was, well, beautifully simple. He kept a single $100 bill, which was a lot of money in the 20s, in his dresser drawer. He called that his fuck you money. The point wasn't to spend it lavishly. It was to secure his independence. That bill meant he could walk away from any film, any script, if he felt it was beneath him. It just eliminated that professional desperation. His supposed, quote, sums it up perfectly. The only good reason for making money was, quote, so you can tell any son of a bitch in the world to go to hell. The drive is autonomy, pure and simple, not luxury.
Which brings us right to the core confusion that really defines the debate today. Is FU money a specific number, a target you hit, or is it purely a state of mind? We saw survey data from Financial Samurai readers, people aiming for that traditional FI, and they were looking at some massive targets.
Yeah, the consensus among those readers, the ones really aiming for true financial independence where they live off the income without touching the principal. Well, their figures generally fell somewhere between, say, $5 million and $10 million. And that target, it's calculated to generate really substantial essentially risk-free annual income, maybe around $250,000 a year, which could support a high-cost lifestyle indefinitely. For them, that huge net worth is the prerequisite for being truly post-economic.
But then the deep dish source immediately pushes back with a really powerful counter idea, what they call fuck you frugality.
Right, and this is where the mindset really starts to take precedence over the dollar figure. The insight is simple, but quite profound. Freedom doesn't have to mean saving $10 million. It can be achieved by deliberately, maybe even ruthlessly, cutting down how much money you actually need to live. The author gives their own example, living comfortably on just, say, 10 to 15,000 US dollars a year.
And if you just do the basic math on that, it changes the accessibility completely. If you only need $15,000 a year, your total savings goal for FI drops. I mean, dramatically. Maybe 20 times lower than someone aiming for $5 million. That just blows the doors open on who can achieve this kind of liberation and how quickly.
It absolutely democratizes the whole concept. And this leads us straight to that critical philosophical takeaway from Vicino's perspective. He says, quote, "FU money is less about a particular sum of money and more about a state of mind." The psychological part here is rooted in whether you, as an individual, deeply accept the consequences of your financial choices, your lifestyle choices.
Vicino also gives us a helpful way to think about the layers, the progression. You start with financial security of just basic needs covered reliably. Then you move up to financial freedom, which is more about buying back your time, making choices about work and where you live. And then finally, there's this idea of FU money as sort of a post-economic stage where money genuinely becomes irrelevant to your daily decisions.
Yes, but Vicino's own story is also a really potent cautionary tale about how stable that state of mind actually is. When he was younger, traveling, living in a van, very independently, he had this profound feeling of being post-economic. Money wasn't driving his actions. He had that core FU attitude.
But that freedom he felt was sort of built on accumulating risk, wasn't it?
Exactly. The consequences eventually came due. He was, racking up debt and maybe not contributing to the community around him in ways he later felt were important. The consequence wasn't just running out of cash. It was broader social, relational impacts. As he got older, his tolerance for that kind of risk shifted. He realized the cost of that isolation. It really shows that the state of mind needed for FU money isn't fixed. It's constantly being renegotiated against your own evolving sense of what risks and consequences are acceptable.
So we've looked at liberation through having lots of money and liberation through needing very little money. But Williamson brings in a third really compelling path to liberation that's not financial at all. The fuck you family.
This is a fascinating sociological point because it suggests you can achieve the same psychological result, freedom from needing external validation, but through relationships and commitment, not wealth. The source talks about how many fathers report this dramatic, permanent shift in their priorities right after starting a family. Suddenly, all the old status games at work, needing admiration from colleagues, trying to impress powerful people, it all just seemed, juvenile and shallow.
Yeah, the source says their anxiety about what others thought, were they successful enough? Were they cool? It just evaporated.
And the reason is quite simple, really. The only people they genuinely needed to impress anymore were their own children, who probably already saw them as heroes anyway. This relational shift is obviously much cheaper, far more accessible to everyone than saving millions, and potentially provides a more psychologically robust kind of freedom than wealth alone. It grants this really profound liberation, letting them dismiss all that flotsam and jetsam, as the source puts it, of external status markers that used to dominate how they saw themselves. #tab the psychological impact of financial autonomy.
It seems clear then that reaching this kind of autonomy, whether it's through money or relationships, it fundamentally changes how a person sees the world. Let's dive now into that specific psychological impact. What are the numerical points, if any, that seem to trigger this mindset shift? We saw some interesting numbers coming out of those financial independence forums.
Yes, there was a recurring data point across several discussions, particularly on Reddit, it seems. People often mention a kind of psychological watershed moment when they hit around $300,000 in liquid assets. Now, for many participants who are living on, say, an annual budget of about $60,000, that $300K figure represented a critical 5-year buffer.
5 years of runway, guaranteed. That must just fundamentally change your relationship with fear, right? The immediate gut-level fear of getting wiped out, losing your job, a health crisis, that gets radically reduced. It's not just financial, it's psychological security.
Absolutely. And that buffer translates directly into confidence. It really empowers the individual to genuinely say, you know what, I don't actually need this job. Or maybe even think, go ahead, fire me if you want. Mhm. And interestingly, this newfound boldness, it often leads counterintuitively to better career outcomes. The sources show people with this cushion feel free to ask for big raises or directly call out unreasonable demands or, corporate nonsense without that fear of reprisal. And often that leads to higher income, better job titles in the long run.
And there's that crucial shift in language, too, that really captures the power dynamic change. The mindset moves from thinking about quitting your job, which feels reactive, maybe even defeatist, to thinking about firing your job.
Exactly. Firing the job implies you're the one in control now. It's a proactive stance. It means the individual is now the one evaluating the job, making sure it meets their needs and expectations, instead of constantly trying to meet the employer's demands. This transfer of power, underpinned by that financial buffer, is the real psychological expression of that FU attitude in practice.
But this pursuit of FI, as good as it sounds, in many ways, it isn't free. There are hidden costs, right? The sort of dark side that the motivational posters often gloss over. What are the trade-offs the sources highlight when people go down this path?
The sources, like the one from Dew, are pretty sobering here. Achieving that level of saving and investment often demands unexpected sacrifices, and the primary cost, overwhelmingly, seems to be time. People chasing FI often have to give up things like spontaneous trips or just quality time hanging out with family and friends because they're so focused on aggressive saving, extreme frugality, and constantly managing their investments. It takes intense focus and energy.
And the mental health side. I mean, if you're constantly being told to hustle, save every penny, optimize everything, isn't anxiety just baked into this whole process rather than being some kind of temporary side effect?
The research certainly suggests it's tightly linked. That rigorous, often relentless pursuit of FI is demonstrably connected to higher levels of anxiety, stress, even depression for some. The sources really emphasize that self-care, things like meditation, exercise, deliberately protecting time for relationships, it's not just nice to have. It's an essential defense against burnout on what is usually a multi-year, high-pressure journey.
And beyond the risk of burnout during the journey, what happens when people actually hit the target? The sources mention a potential identity crisis once independence is reached.
Yes, this is the existential curveball. For many people, especially successful professionals, their identity gets really wrapped up in their job title, their salary, their status at work. So when those external markers are either deliberately removed or just become irrelevant because they've reached FI, it forces this really fundamental question. Okay, without my job title, without my bank balance defining me, who exactly am I?
Yeah.
The sources stress that success has to be proactively redefined based on internal things. Pursuing passions, hobbies, community involvement, the depth of your relationships. And that transition period can be really psychologically disorienting for people.
And that feeling of disorientation seems to lead directly into what some sources call the post-independence void. That stark and maybe often disappointing realization that just having financial independence doesn't automatically equal happiness.
Boredom is flagged as a genuine threat by people who reach FI. Just having unstructured idleness, if you don't manage it, can quickly breed feelings of depression, anxiety, a real sense of apathy. Financial independence doesn't mean stopping everything. It really means having the freedom for purposeful redirection. It requires planning, thinking ahead about how you'll fill that time finding hobbies, maybe starting a second career based on passion, mentoring others, volunteering.
And the common idea of retirement just being endless leisure, sitting on a beach, the evidence suggests that's mostly a myth for FI folks.
Absolutely. Almost everyone who reaches FI continues doing something that looks a lot like work. They might write books, manage investments actively, start small businesses, mentor others. The crucial difference isn't the activity, it's the motivation. It shifts completely. You're no longer doing it because you need the money. You're doing it for intrinsic reasons: purpose, mastery, contribution, enjoyment.
But there's a danger too, isn't there? That the intense focus needed to get to FI can actually warp how someone sees the world, leading to this risk of converting everything into just a monetary value.
Yes, that's highlighted as a significant psychological pitfall of that hyper-focused FI journey. The constant drive to optimize every dollar, save every penny, can lead someone to start valuing everything: relationships, their time, even possessions, purely based on its monetary worth or how it contributes to the bottom line. This obviously strains relationships. It can also make simple decision-making incredibly tedious. And this ties into a known concept from behavioral science called the endowment effect.
Right. Before we move on, maybe just quickly explain the endowment effect in this context.
Sure, the endowment effect is basically a cognitive bias, where we tend to place a much higher value on something simply because we own it, or because it took us a lot of effort to get it. So in the FI context, it can make rational actions like maybe selling an investment that's not performing well, or even just decluttering your house feel psychologically difficult and costly. We overvalue what we have, reinforcing that focus on monetary worth even when it's not really logical. Hashtag the ethical and sociological dimensions of wealth.
Okay, so acknowledging these psychological shifts that wealth seems to trigger, maybe reducing empathy, increasing that focus on accumulation, it really forces us to look beyond just the individual bank account and ask broader questions. How does money actually shape society? The psychological research you mentioned from the Greater Good Science Center suggests wealth can have a pretty profound impact on moral behavior.
Yes, and the findings they report are presented as impartial, based on rigorous data. They highlight what researchers call the empathy gap. Studies have consistently shown that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to be significantly better at reading other people's facial expressions, which is a key indicator of empathy compared to wealthier individuals.
And the explanation isn't that they're inherently different people, it's about their environment, their structural necessities.
Precisely. The theory is that chronic dependency on others, which is often more characteristic of lower-class environments, it necessitates constant social scanning. You have to be vigilant, looking out for potential social threats or crucial opportunities. This constant need fosters higher emotional intelligence. Conversely, it seems just feeling wealthy can trigger less pro-social behavior. We see this even in controlled experiments.
That UC Berkeley Monopoly experiment is a really striking example of how quickly that can happen.
It really is. Researchers set up a rigged game of Monopoly, where one player was arbitrarily given much more starting money than the other. Initially, the richer player often showed a bit of awkwardness about the unfair advantage, but that feeling apparently faded quite quickly. They started acting more aggressively, more entitled, taking up more physical space, moving their pieces more loudly, even starting to taunt the poorer opponent. It clearly demonstrates that just the feeling of having more, even if it's fake money, can instill this sense of, well, license.
And this sense of entitlement seems to spill over into real-world behavior, particularly around following social norms.
We see that quite vividly with driving behavior. A study in San Francisco found drivers in luxury cars were 4 times less likely to stop for pedestrians waiting at crosswalks compared to drivers in less expensive cars. Other research shows that even just activating the concept of money, like having people unscramble sentences with money-related words, made them significantly more likely to lie or behave immorally in tasks that followed. It seems the mere focus on money can somehow cloud moral judgment.
Given this evidence that the pursuit of ever more wealth might actually compromise your principles, it makes the idea of setting a contentment benchmark, which Carrier-Wise talks about, seem absolutely essential.
Yes, this idea is framed as a preventative measure against that potential moral drift. I mean, look at the extreme examples like Ruja Ignatova, the crypto queen. She generated maybe $4 billion in the OneCoin Ponzi scheme, then vanished, ending up on the FBI's most wanted list.
Why do people who are already incredibly successful, often high achievers, end up involved in these huge corporate scams? What's the thinking there?
Well, the late Harvard professor Clayton Christensen had a theory about this. He argued that these catastrophic failures often happen because the individuals never actually stopped to define what personal contentment looked like for them. Their ambition just became untethered from any sense of enough. He offered a really critical insight. It's easier to hold to your principles 100% of the time than it is to hold on to them 98% of the time. That tiny 2% margin, that's where the small compromises start, where maybe corruption can take root, and where the endless pursuit of more starts to justify dubious actions.
So the real antidote to potentially endless greed isn't necessarily more rules, but defining a personal finish line.
Exactly. The source material really advocates for actively setting a clear contentment benchmark for yourself. They get an example of an investor whose sole financial goal was just having enough money to keep traveling frequently with his wife. That single, defined, and relatively modest goal became his functional benchmark. It acted as a shield, protecting him from the temptation to chase excessive wealth through potentially dubious things. It kept him grounded.
This feels like a really crucial pivot point in our deep dive. We've spent a lot of time talking about how you, the individual, might save your way to freedom. But now we need to seriously engage with the sources that argue, quite forcefully, that for vast numbers of people, the entire system is structured in a way that might prevent that from ever being a realistic possibility. Let's bring in that sociological perspective from the LSE research now, which takes us far beyond individual savings habits.
Right. The LSE paper makes a strong case that the sheer scale and the recent intensification of wealth inequality represent a dramatic change of our time. And it's a change, they argue, that traditional class analysis, often focused just on income or occupation, hasn't really kept up with. The global numbers they cite really underscore the urgency. Global wealth stocks have apparently more than doubled just since 1995.
But the distribution of that new wealth tells a very different story, suggesting a system deeply stratified against the majority.
Massively so. According to the research, the poorest half of the entire world's population owns just 2% of total global wealth. Meanwhile, the richest 10% holds 76%. Wealth, in this view, clearly isn't just about how much you earn anymore. It's fundamentally relational. It defines power, it defines domination, which means we need to move beyond simple income-based ways of thinking about class.
And the sources draw on both classic Marxist and Weberian ideas to describe how this new dynamic of exploitation works, specifically through this concept of rents. Before we go further, maybe just clarify what rents mean in this modern context.
Sure. So in this updated model, exploitation happens less through industrial production and labor and more through generating rents. These are essentially excess profits that come from owning enduring, often passive, rent-producing assets. Think about financial instruments, patents, but most commonly, land and real estate. This forms the basis of what these scholars call modern rentier capitalism. A prime example they might point to is the assetification of housing by huge private equity firms globally. Wealth is generated simply by owning these assets and extracting higher rents, not necessarily by building anything new or improving a service.
Which means that your relationship to credit and debt becomes a central dividing line in contemporary class structures.
Absolutely. The Weberian part of the analysis really highlights how sophisticated tools like credit scoring create vastly different market situations for people. Those who are disadvantaged often get trapped in these spiraling debt cycles, maybe through high-interest payday loans or fringe banking, making any upward mobility incredibly difficult. Meanwhile, the most advantaged often get access to cheap credit, low-interest loans, which allows them to buy assets, leverage tax breaks, and accelerate their own wealth accumulation, benefiting hugely from things like rising property values.
And housing specifically is positioned in this analysis not just as shelter or even just a simple asset, but as a key driver of people's life chances today.
Yes, the model proposed by Adkins and colleagues really drives this home. They actually suggest classifying people based almost entirely on their relationship to housing assets. Are you an investor, an outright owner, a homeowner still paying a mortgage, a renter, or are you homeless? This framework underscores the reality, especially in major cities, that housing wealth, particularly when asset prices climb much faster than wages, increasingly acts as the primary mechanism distributing opportunities, health outcomes, and basic economic stability.
And finally, the analysis stresses how this system of wealth accumulation intersects with and actually worsens existing deeply entrenched inequalities, particularly around race and gender.
Yes, the LSE research explicitly connects these modern wealth gaps back to brutal colonial histories and, critically, to the legacy of slavery, which was, of course, a unique and horrific form of property ownership itself. These historical foundations, combined with ongoing issues like predatory lending practices targeting minority communities, housing discrimination, and systemic barriers to passing down generational wealth, all fuel these substantial racial wealth gaps we still see today. They note the pioneering work of W.B. Du Bois over a century ago, showing how things like urban segregation and racialized job markets work together to suppress Black wealth accumulation remains incredibly relevant.
And the very ways wealth gets passed down are also shown to be profoundly gendered, often reinforcing male control.
That's correct. The research points out that durable wealth institutions, things like family trusts or foundations, very often privilege male heirs. Studies indicate that even within wealthy families, sons are more likely to inherit businesses or assets expected to generate higher returns, while daughters might receive real estate or other assets with lower value or less potential for growth. Plus, across different economic levels, women consistently bear a disproportionately larger economic burden after separation or divorce, which systematically widens the gender wealth gap over time. So this structural view really forces us to remember that where the individual journey towards something like FU money is about personal effort and choices, your ability to even start that journey is heavily influenced by where you begin within these complex, layered, and often deeply unfair systems. Hashtag outro cut.
Well, we have certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into fuck you money. We've looked at it through the lens of numerical targets, the psychology of autonomy, and this really crucial structural critique. We sort of mapped out three potential paths to liberation that emerge from the sources. There's the high accumulation route, aiming for that post-economic status. There's the radical path of extreme frugality, lowering your needs. And then there's that relational path, the fuck you family, which sidesteps the money issue altogether by changing what you value.
What really stands out, I think, is this inherent tension, this collision between individual ambition and the need for ethical guardrails. The sources give us pretty clear evidence suggesting that the single-minded pursuit of more and more wealth can be linked to, well, lower empathy and maybe developing moral blind spots. Meanwhile, cultivating genuine lasting contentment seems to be a much more reliable defense against greed and corruption than just having a high net worth. So this raises a really critical question for you, the listener, to maybe reflect on. Given that your ambition, unchecked, could potentially risk overshadowing your core principles, what is the clear, actionable contentment benchmark that you should define for yourself right now, today, before that pursuit of wealth maybe risks turning you into the very kind of person you were trying to escape in the first place?
That's a really powerful thought to end on. We definitely encourage you to subscribe, like this discussion, and please comment, continue this vital conversation on our platforms. We'd love to hear what your personal contentment benchmark might be, or how you think about navigating these tensions yourself.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.